So really today we've got two lectures in the two halves. I haven't kind of split them up in the way that I normally do. So the first half is to do with numbers, and the second half is to do with literacy. And both kind of seem to be similar in the sense that you might imagine them to be kind of culturally learnt skills. You know, you need to attend maths classes, you need to be taught to read, and so on. And obviously there is an element of truth in that. I think one of the other things I want to talk about is, well, although we kind of learn and kind of knowledge of these systems is culturally embedded, that there is something quite fundamental in our brains that enables us to acquire this set of skills. We kind of have a starter kit for both, and thinking about what is that starter kit and how it works. And really this also relates to issues to do with development as well. So the lecture next week is also on development. So it kind of hangs together as 3 hour-long lectures. So what do we mean by numbers? And you know, given that we all learn maths at school, what does it even mean for some elements of number to be innate? And that's what we'll talk about quite a bit today. So really with numbers, we're not just talking about kind of language, and so we're talking about how many, how much. And this is something that, you know, perhaps animals can understand, and also infants as well. So this is the kind of habituation study done with infants, where you present a stimulus, say 2 dots, and then you present another 2 dots, and then another 2 dots. So each stimulus is physically different, but what you kind of measure is the amount of time an infant looks at that stimulus. And what you find is that over time it will look at this, it will look at that a little bit less, it looks at that less and that less, and then you swap the stimulus. So here you change it from 2 to 3. And what you find is that you've got a kind of the infant's attention dwindling, and then when it goes from 2 to 3, you'll see that it kind of switches. It realizes there's been a change. So even though each of these steps has a change, here you've got a number change in effect from 2 to 3. And it's not just that they prefer more, so here you get the same effect going from 3 to 2 with that. And we can talk about how this is done, but certainly infants can keep track of exact quantities up to about 4. Beyond that, they can check differences, but not individually, so they can't tell the difference between 6 and 7, but they might tell the difference between 6 and 10 or 6 and 12, for instance, okay, where we've got that. But this is something we'll do. So they can, it's not that they break down at 4, they can deal with quantities more than 4, but that's not at that level of precision. So again, this is not something that is culturally acquired. It's something that is, you know, part of the starting kit for doing that. But there are things that are culturally acquired. So I've written numbers, and names for them, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, and so on. The fact that we use base 10 and so on, we could use other base systems, binary or whatever. You know, some ancients kind of had things based on base 60, which is why we've got 60 seconds in a minute and so on. You know, there's no, aside from our 10 fingers, which is, well, there's nothing special or innate about that. Okay, algebra, calculus, and so on. These are kind of cultural tools that we're kind of embedding on top of other basic skills. And again, it dates back a long time. So these are kind of caveman counting, kind of, you know, the cycles of the moon here on a piece of bone, and so on. So, you know, you kind of have this. In infants, you have it potentially in other species, which I'll talk about, and, you know, kind of human answers. So what is, what are kind of numbers in terms of the meaning or what they convey? So here there are various things. So it's really to do with quantity, how much, the size of a collection, and so on. So the size of a collection refers to kind of integers, okay, or numerosity. Other kind of quantities such as area and length and so on also relate to numbers. And people debate even now whether or not it's the same system as kind of deals with exact quantities here, 3, 4, 5, as deals with the idea of few versus many, or kind of length, short versus long, whether one is kind of, whether they're 2 separate systems or the same. So, but either way, they certainly are using similar parts of the brain. So it's your parietal lobes and so on involved in different kinds of quantity. So judging greater than, less than, is the same whether you've got a length and area or the number 8 versus the number 5 written in kind of cultural symbols. Okay. And one thing to contrast it to is something like a telephone number. So a telephone number doesn't have meaning in the sense that it would be meaningless to say my telephone number is bigger than yours, because that's not the way in which it's used. It's just an arbitrary convention in which we use numbers. And we could dial with letters, we could dial with any kind of code, and that would carry the same meaning. It's not denoting quantity or amount, and so on. House numbers are a bit different. So here it's not denoting quantity, but it's denoting order. Okay, so a slightly different thing, but a telephone number isn't a number in the true sense of the word, okay? It just happens to use those particular codes. And again, it's kind of abstract. We can talk about what that means in the context of other lectures to do with semantics, but I think the key thing here is that you can have 3 sounds, 3 ideas, 3 chairs, but they all share the same meaning, this idea of threeness, okay? So it's not grounded in one particular thing. It might be that what the brain does is it actually transforms it in some way into some kind of spatial code or whatever. This is one idea, but the actual kind of inputs into them is not tied to one particular system. So I'll start off by looking at non-symbolic number cognition. So here this is to do with amounts, kind of quantities. So here there are various ways in which we can say that. You can take an array such as this and you can ask a question, which has more, the answer being either blue or yellow, or how many are there? Are there 8 or yellow ones, whatever. So one is kind of a relative judgment. There's an absolute. So here there are more, and the idea is you can do this in a glance. So you can do that, you can certainly do the first answer without counting them, okay? That you can look at that and say the answer is yellow. And you can kind of measure that in reaction time, error rates or whatever. The other thing to say that is often done in here is that typically what they would do is that they vary the size of the dots so you can kind of equate the surface area. So here, I can't tell whether it's actually been done with this stimulus, but the amount of blue and the amount of yellow is equated, but the number of yellow objects or yellow shapes would differ from the amount of blue. So on average, it would probably mean that your blue dots are larger than the yellow dots if there are fewer, numerically fewer of them. And this is something that you can train animals to do, and so it gives you this kind of cross-cultural comparison. And what you find, and this is true of infants, human adults, and it's found in birds, it's found in fish. I meant to check how they're intended in fish. I think it's to do with kind of where they get their food from and so on. That you've got these similar kinds of properties. And what you find is 2 properties here relating to how easy this task is. So one is the number of items, how many things there are in there. So if you've got 20 yellow, yes, it's that way around. Yeah, so if you've got 30 items on there, it's going to be harder than there are 15, even if they're in the same ratio. So if you end up with kind of 20 yellow and 10 blue, you're going to find it harder to make that judgment than 10 fine. You can measure that in accuracy or response times and so on. So even though they're in the same ratio, just the more things that there are, the harder it is to do that. And the other thing, and that's called the size effect. We'll come back to that in a bit. And there's something called the distance effect. And that's basically to do with kind of the size of the ratio. So judging whether there are 6 or 5 is harder than judging if there are 7 versus 5, okay? So here you've got a distance of 1 between them, and here you've got a distance of 2 between them, okay? So here you've got things that are approximately the same size, but you're varying the distance between them. So you can effectively measure your acuity with numbers in doing this kind of task. And you can show kind of developmentally in humans that their acuity kind of goes up. So I think they start off with being able to distinguish ratios of about 2, and then they're able to distinguish ratios about 1.5 and so on. So they kind of reach the adult level of being able to do this kind of task. But it does matter. So one thing that's interesting is that on this particular task, it's kind of a Nature paper. What they do is that they look at children's ability to do this task. And what you find is that it correlates very highly with school-based maths performance in SATs tests. So this is something that's very basic insofar as, other species can do it, infants can do it, but nevertheless, when you get to age 7, 8, or 9, it predicts performance, including kind of retrospectively. So what they did here is that they took, say, 8-year-old children, looked at their ability to do this task, and then they could look at their maths level when they entered primary school from kindergarten and showed that the two still correlate over this 4-year period. Here it goes backwards in time rather than forwards in time. The ability to do this task at 8 predicts how good their school maths was, dealing with language-based maths and so on there. So the idea is that this is some kind of startup kit for numeracy that is evolutionary ancient and supports other aspects of, I guess, culturally embedded school maths and algebra. So. And not everybody, so there's a phenomenon called developmental dyscalculia, which you could think of as being like the equivalent of dyslexia. Okay? So the idea is it's a relatively selective problem in understanding numbers and maths. It doesn't have quite the same status as dyslexia, and it's kind of a newer phenomenon. The government hasn't recognised it, probably for political reasons rather than scientific reasons. As soon as you recognise something, you're going to have to invest in it and talk about that. But it certainly does exist in the same way as dyslexia exists as being a particular problem. And again, it's not just a particular problem in algebra and calculus and the boring maths. If you have these kind of school-level impairments in maths, you will be down on this kind of basic task of discriminating the yellow from the blue here. Okay? Yeah.
Does that imply that that developmental kit that you were mentioning earlier is missing, or is just atypically developed?
Yes. Well, I don't. It's not missing at all in the sense that they can do the task. It's just that they can't do it with the level of precision of other people. So it would be it exists kind of more efficient towards disruptive. It's not matured in the same way, or it wasn't. The circuits for doing that in the brain weren't properly put into place, and this has a knock-on effect when you go to school and start learning your other maths. And in other cultures where you don't learn maths and so on, it probably would have no difference at all. It's just being in a very numerate culture, but all of a sudden you would notice this. Okay, so you would find this in other cultures, but you wouldn't notice it unless you have a school-level maths. So you've got this interesting kind of culture and environment that you would only see the deficit. So here, that's to do with relative judgments. There's a phenomenon to do with absolute judgments, and this kind of comes back to what I mentioned with infants. Now here the task is very different. You see an array of kind of collections like this, and your task is to say how many are there. So it's not, you have to give an exact number to that. And what you've got here is response times, and here you've got your error rate. And basically what's reported is that up until about 3 or 4 items, you can do this effortlessly. So what it means is that doing it with 4 is pretty much not as double as doing it with 2, okay? But once you get beyond 4, you've got this doubling period that 8 is pretty much double of 4 and so on. And the idea here is that you've got 2 different mechanisms for doing an absolute judgment. One of which is that you can just take in, all in one glance, how many objects there are exactly, up to about 4. Beyond 4, you can do it approximately. Or you either do it approximately, or you use a different strategy, which is counting, which is a serial strategy of going on each one in turn, and you kind of keep tabs with it using language or not numerals, tallies, whatever other system you have. So you can get exact numbers of 4. Beyond that, you can only do it. You can get exact numbers of 4 in parallel, if you will, at a glance, and beyond that you go to a serial strategy. And this means you've got a flat kind of function, which means that you can get the numerosity of 1, 2, 3, 4 without any cost. And then beyond that, the cost is that you've got to go to each one in turn. Okay? And this is kind of what you kind of see in the infants as well, is that they can get to about 3 or 4 exactly, and then beyond that they can just do relative judgments that they can't tell the difference between 5 and 6, and an infant can't count. So we can develop another strategy for telling whether there are 5 or 6 that is not available to them. So again, counting is something that perhaps relies on language, or at least this kind of strategy that this is not available necessarily to other species or to infants in this case. So that's those are kind of non-symbolic numbers. What about our kind of cultural numbers, the fact that we have digits and number names and so on? So the intriguing thing here is that you get the same effects when you're processing digits as you get when you're processing collections that are presented to you visually. So what you find here, so this is the distance effect there. So what it means is that so what you get here is that you're presented with two numbers on a computer screen, 9 or 8, and you have to say which number is larger, okay, or smaller, it doesn't matter. And what you find is that it's harder to tell which number is larger or smaller when the number is 9 or 8 with a distance of 1, and it's easier when the distance is 5. And this is what you've got here in response time. So this is exactly the same as trying to resolve 8 dots versus 9 dots, which is hard, and 2 versus 7. But here, there's nothing perceptually demanding about the numbers 8 or 9. You can see them very clearly. It's something to do with the fact that your number system cannot resolve numbers even when you can see the digits themselves. It's almost that 8 and 9 are confusable because they have a similar meaning. They denote a collection of a similar sized quantity, even when they're expressed in this abstract, entirely cultural code. Okay? So you get the distance effect and the size effect. So for instance, telling which number is larger out of 5 and 3 is harder than telling which number is larger out of 4 and 2, even though they've got a distance of 2, because 5 and 3 is a numerically larger number than 4 and 2. Or telling whether 7 and 9, which is bigger, is harder than telling whether 1 and 3, which one's bigger, okay? So again, and people kind of explain this in terms of this sort of mechanism there. The other way of thinking about it is that within the brain, your kind of ability to process numbers kind of becomes more blurred the larger the number gets, so that you can process 1 very accurately, 2 very accurately, 3 very accurately. Beyond that, it's almost as if the meaning of 7 and the meaning of 8 is kind of almost blending into each other, if you will, even though the actual digits themselves are trying to kind of keep them separate as entities in your head. But these two different kinds of codes also interact. So this is kind of like a Stroop effect with numbers, where you have to say which number is larger. Well, there are two tasks. Which is numerically larger here? So the answer is 9, and the answer is 9 there. 9 is numerically larger, but here you're much slower at saying that 9 is numerically larger in this case than you are in that one there. And the idea is that here it is physically smaller. So physical size and the abstract meaning of numbers, it's almost as if they kind of converge and interfere with each other in the same one. And you get the same one here. You have to say which digit is physically larger. So here the correct answer is 9, here the correct answer is 2. But saying this digit is physically larger is slower because there's something here telling you, hang on, that's numerically larger. So you can't pull them apart completely in the task, and it disrupts your performance. But the two codes all do kind of interact with each other as well. So this is kind of a priming study where you present a number subliminally. So you might present the digit 3 subliminally, for instance, and then what you'll get shown is that you then get shown the word, say, S-E-V-E-N. You have to decide whether that is larger or smaller than 5. So if you've been shown a 3, it's kind of priming you towards a little number, and then you see 7, and then you're slower at saying that 7 is larger than 5, so you're primed with 3. Whereas if you show, say, a number like 6, which is larger than 5, then you're faster at saying it's 7, 7. But the point is you do this even though the number was unconscious. And also you get it for dot arrays and other kinds of codes as well here. So again, the digit dots can prime digits and so on. You can have that kind of thing. So it suggests that this convergence of codes and the idea of having something that is abstract in the sense that it doesn't depend on one kind of representation. All number units kind of map onto that, whether it's dots on screen or symbolic notation. Okay. Okay, so this takes us to the paper that I sent around, which is to do with how you can understand, again, it relates to the interaction between language, which we can think of as a symbolic number system, and other kinds of numbers, so the number of pebbles that you might have, or stones and food and so on. So there's various studies done on this. This is a tribe called the Munduruku who live in Amazonia. It's also been done with Australian Aboriginals who also have similar kind of language things with number. But anyway, this is their how their number system kind of works here. So what they're given here is that they're given, say, 11 dots, 11 pebbles, whatever they are. I think they use beans there. And they're just asked, what is this called? And if you were to ask this to a Westerner, they would go, it's called 11, okay? And they would not deviate in that answer. We would give unless we're asked to kind of guess it instantly, we would give that thing. And what you find is that when they're given with 1, there's pretty much 100% agreement what it's called. It's called their equivalent of 1, which is called Pugma or something like this. I'm not going to read it. With 2, you've also got the same thing, that they have a conventional name for 2. And then when you get to 3 or 4, people kind of don't know what to call 3 so much, and they've got a 70% agreement. Whereas if we have 3 pigs and you ask, what number are we going to call that? It's hard to imagine it would be anything than 100%, okay? And then 4, then here you've got these very general things, which we could think of as being a few versus many. So it's almost if you've got 1, 2, 3, a bit more, many lots, and that this is how their number system works. They haven't got numbers for every integer value. So the question is, can they process integer values, and can they understand it semantically in the absence of this language, this kind of cultural aid? Okay. So that's what they did here. So I'll give you a minute or two to think about that. If you've read the paper, come up with the questions as well. So what is it that they can do well? Okay, so let's start with this one here. So what this task is that they, you've got this kind of metal drum, okay, and you see a kind of collection of, I think that they're coffee beans or something. Can you remember what they are? It's something like this. But anyway, you see a kind of an array of them in here, and then the experimenter puts them in there, and then the experimenter takes another collection and puts them in there. So it's kind of addition, but with these ones here. And then the question here is that they're then shown another collection, and the answer is that what you would expect to see if you add together N1 and N2, would you expect to get N3, okay? And you can, here you've got French controls and the Munduruku. So this is approximate addition because it's done so fast that you can't count them. So even in France, they could give you an exact answer if they were given enough time to count out them up. But the French, they can't do that here. What you find is that you get these kinds of curves here. So here, when it's a very big ratio, that here, that this is 4 times, that these two, N1 and N2 differs by N3 by a magnitude of 4. This is trivially easy and everyone's at 100%. And as these magnitudes, or the ratios between what you're adding and what you expect kind of decreases, it becomes harder to figure out whether they could plausibly do the same one. But the drop-off curve is pretty much identical. So they can appreciate numbers to some extent, even beyond their counting range, that they can do this. Here, so this is approximate addition. Here you're dealing with exact numbers. So these are small numbers. And what you do is that you, so here you've got 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. So you add 5 beans to the pot. And then you see somebody take 4 beans out. And then the question is, how many are left? Is it 0, 1, or 2? Okay? And you can vary the kind of the size of these sets here. And what you find is that for small numbers, up to about 2, both the French and the Munduruku can do this. So the Munduruku can do this one here. But they can't do it when you get much beyond about 3 or 4. Their ability to do it effectively drops off. Okay? Presumably because here this is within a kind of a counting range of the French people that is outside of their counting range, and their language doesn't enable them to do that. Yeah? Any kind of thoughts or questions about this? So they can do approximate arithmetic, and they can do exact arithmetic for small numbers, but not exact arithmetic for large numbers, is basically the answer in terms of what they can do. They can also do division with larger numbers. It's been shown that here you can do this as a strategy. If you've got a collection you need to divide into 2 or 3, you just do it by 1. So you haven't got to know what the set size is in order to divide. Obviously you do with proper numbers like 21 divided by 7. That's a very different skill, and they wouldn't have the language to be able to do that. But they can divide 21 into 3 sets of 7, despite not having the number 21 or the number 7 in their system. Okay. Any questions about this one? It's interesting, isn't it? People debate, well, does that mean that they can't understand bigger numbers? And it isn't really. So other people said that they can understand, because numbers they understand the kind of adding 1 principle. So if you've got 11, you know that you can create a number by adding another 1. So they understand that there are larger numbers and that they differ by the principle of 1. So some people say they can comprehend them, they just can't map it on to any kind of system that helps them.
I would argue it's the other way around, that we can't understand large numbers. We can manipulate them using symbols and things like that, but doesn't that study that says if you've got, say, 2 and 4, and saying which is larger, or 184 and 182, which is larger,
yes,
our ability to comprehend larger and larger numbers gets harder and harder.
Exactly, that's right. So you could say it applies to both, but to some extent, yes, that's right. But you can compensate a little bit by, yes, exactly, that's right, yeah. Yeah, I think that's a fair point as well, yeah, yeah. So how is this dealt with in the brain? So it's believed that our parietal lobes are particularly important for number meaning, and particularly this area called the IPS, the intraparietal sulcus, which effectively goes halfway along the outside of your parietal lobes. And evidence comes from this from patients who have, so this is acquired brain damage, who've had a stroke and so on. They have looked at it in developmental dyscalculia, and you get similar, not holes in the brain, but structural anomalies. And here this is brain imaging, in which you compare, say, calculating versus letter naming. So it would be, it's not fancy maths, it's 8 minus 5 versus reading aloud digits or reading aloud letters, for instance. And you can show that these parts of the brain, the parietal lobes, are involved with that. So, for instance, this part of the brain, the parietal lobes, is more involved in calculating numbers than reading them. So when you're processing the meaning of them as opposed to just viewing. It also shows this priming effect that I talked about earlier, that if you're asked to decide whether something is greater than or less than 5, and you've been primed subliminally by a number that is in the other direction, then this region is kind of sensitive to whether or not the two are kind of matching. The interesting thing is that it shows a distance effect as well. So comparing 5 and 6 activates this region more than comparing 5 and 8, for instance, where 5 and 6 are harder to discriminate because they're similar quantities. So it shows that, and it shows it not just for digits, for number words, and again for dots, for quantities as well, through quantities. And you get habituation to repeat a number of dots. So as in the kind of infant study, you can do this under fMRI, that you just see 2, 2, 2, or all of a sudden you see a 3, and you can show that this kind of tracks a change in number here, or a change in ratio, depending on how you set the study up. So it seems to suggest that this region underlies a lot of the cognitive effects that we've talked about. So this is fMRI in humans. What about in other species? So this is in the macaque brain, and they found neurons that are tuned in to particular numbers. So there are various ways in which neurons can respond to numbers. There are some neurons that respond to larger numbers. So a neuron might respond more to 2 greater than 1, 3 greater than 2. So it shows this kind of linear thing until it saturates. Here you've got numbers that are actually tuned to particular numbers. So it's not that they always like seeing more. They might like seeing 4, but not like seeing 3 or seeing 5. So the task here is that the animal fixates. It's then shown, in this case, 4 dots, delayed, and then it's got 2 ones here, and they have to match or non-match here. And you record the neurons as they kind of process these quantities there, then they're given feedback. what this is here, this is, it looks a little bit similar to the Numerical kind of naming things, but it's not. Here, this is just the number of dots that you're showing in an array, and this is the activity of neurons. So here, this this dark blue neuron would respond to the number, to seeing 1 dot more than 2 dots and 3 dots and 4 dots and 5. So this is a neuron in the, you get them in the frontal lobes and the parietal lobes that responds to seeing 1 thing more than seeing 2 things and 3 things and 4 things. Here this is a neuron that responds to seeing 2 things more than 1 thing and 3 things, and here the blue-green one is a neuron that responds to seeing 3 more than this, and you can carry it on beyond 5 and so on. What you find is, so you've got this selectivity, but what you find is that they actually get closer and closer together. And you can kind of see it happening here if you look at kind of the shape of these V's here, or the slope of the line. So the number 1 kind of has a fast slope, so it responds to 1, but hardly at all to the next number, number 2. Whereas have a look at this one here, neuron that responds to 5, it still responds quite strongly to number 4. So although it responds maximally to number 5, it's kind of had a much broader tuning. So you can see right at the level of single neurons in the brain that as the number of items grows, that the ability of that neuron to respond selectively to that and ignore adjacent numbers effectively drops away. So you get, you know, this effect in behaviour, and right down to single neurons that show this particular response. So you could say that smaller numbers are kind of more finely tuned, and then larger numbers have a broader tuning until beyond about 10 they become almost indiscriminable, these kind of tuning curves. The other thing is that you get them in 2 regions. So one is the same region that's been implicated in adult humans, this IPS region, also the frontal lobes, which I'll talk a little bit about as well. It's also the case that some of them respond to the sequential presentation. So here you've got simultaneous, you see 4 dots. They've also done it where you see 1 dot after another, and you kind of need to keep track of it, which is a little bit like counting, although obviously animals don't count because they haven't got the words for doing that. But it's kind of almost like a proto-counting system that they can keep track of things presented one at a time here. Also, it's not just visual ones, so you can present 3 sounds, again, presumably sequentially, one after the other, and show that a neuron that responds to 3 visual objects will, or some of them would respond to 3 sounds as well. It's not the case that they all do, so some of them seem to respond to 3. Some respond to 3 visual objects, but not 3 sounds. It's not always that they're one and the same. What's interesting is that you can also, here you can train an animal to, so here they're showing 4 dots, and here they're showing comparatively 4 and 3. You can train them, instead of doing that, to respond to our number system, 4 and 3. You can train them to respond to those digits, for instance. It takes a long time to do, but you can get them to do that. And what you find there is that you get neurons in the brain, single neurons that respond to seeing our kind of cultural symbol for the number 4 as for seeing 4 dots. The interesting thing about this is that you don't get them in this kind of core number region in the parietal lobes. You get them in the frontal lobes, okay? And one of the reasons why that's interesting is that in children, what you find is that when children are asked to do maths, they typically use their frontal lobes more than their parietal lobes, and as they mature, the frontal lobes seem to drop off and the parietal lobes seem to go up. And it's not clear what that means. And what it probably means is that one way of thinking about it is the parietal lobes kind of has the core number system that deals with kind of dots and things, whereas your frontal lobes is dealing with them as more kind of rules and linguistic entities, and that eventually the number 8 is kind of that you understand it in a different way as you kind of do that.
Does that mean that if they were to do an fMRI on that tribe that we were talking about earlier, they'd have more activity on frontal lobes?
No, I think it would be exactly the opposite, because I think that they, well, let's think about it. It's certainly big. I'm not sure that they would necessarily have a difference. Certainly, if they're shown dots and so on, they shouldn't be different. If they're shown words. I guess that because they've got fewer words, they would be relying more on the core number system. Whereas in people who have those words, they can rely on other systems as well. That would be how I would think about it. But yeah, it's a good question. Okay, and just to talk about the difference between the left and the right as well. So both the left and the right parietal lobes seem to be involved in the processing of number meaning. They're typically activated when you do fMRI of kind of number tasks. Sometimes you can have dyscalculia just by damaging one side of the brain. And one claim is that although both hemispheres are numerates, they have somewhat different numeracy capacities. So what's often claimed is that your left hemisphere, it's actually coming back to your question about Numerical, you might have more to do with the left and the right. So one idea is that the left hemisphere deals more with exact quantities, whereas the right hemisphere deals more with approximate quantities. So the left hemisphere knows that it's 5 exactly, and the right hemisphere thinks it might be 5, but it could be 4 or 6, would be one way of thinking about that. And the evidence for this comes from, for instance, patients who have dyscalculia having damaged their left hemisphere, who become very poor at maths, but can still give plausible answers. So when shown 5 plus 7, they say it's roughly 13. Okay, so it's not that they've completely lost their numeracy capabilities. It's just that it's kind of almost lost its precision. And the idea here is that the right hemisphere system is not as precisely tuned for this kind of thing. And that's kind of almost what the Numerical are doing. They know if you have 5 and 7 cells, it's about that, but I couldn't be sure whether it's this or that or the other. Yeah. Again, one question is to why that is. And the obvious answer is that the left hemisphere communicates more with the language system, and that whereas the right hemisphere is a little bit more separate from the language system. The left hemisphere can kind of get you these exact quantities, either because the number meanings themselves become tuned by language, or that the number system can kind of feed into language, and that language is kind of supporting it, kind of acting as an aid, if you will, to doing this sort of process. And you also get it in patients with split brain. So split brain patients don't have brain damage in the conventional sense of the word. What they've had is an operation that separates their hemispheres. So the two hemispheres are intact, but they can't talk to each other. And what you can do here is that you can flash letters or digits to one side of the visual field, which goes to one hemisphere and not the other. So the two hemispheres can't talk. If you flash it in the middle, it will go to both hemispheres because that's how it works. But if you flash it one, that'd be great. So here, what happens is that if you send a number such as 5 to the left hemisphere, your kind of your talking hemisphere, it can tell you that that is the number 5. Okay. If you flash it to the right hemisphere, it makes about 46% of errors. So it doesn't always say it's 5. It kind of remember it's flashed briefly, so it's a hard one. But what it makes is kind of approximate guesses. So it might say that 5 is 6. So it's almost as if it knows roughly what the quantity is, but not the exact quantity. Now, whether this is to do with the number meaning system or that this is just kind of related to language, that here you can go from a written symbol to a spoken symbol without going via number meaning in your left hemisphere. Whereas in your right hemisphere, you haven't got a language thing, so you have to go to the core number system. The core number system doesn't know exactly what it is, and then it feeds back to the language system. That's the kind of claim here. That's what might be. So this is Dehaene's model as to how these different kind of systems may come together. So he's called it the triple code model. And basically what he's saying is that skilled maths is kind of using a number of systems in the brain. Yes, we have this kind of core system in our parietal lobes, which he's put here in purple, called it magnitude representation here, for doing approximate calculation, comparison, and so on. And then he says we've got other systems that kind of support that. So we've got our verbal system here, our system for what we call numbers, and that this actually aids, it kind of supports this system here. And then you've got your visual representation of numbers, which is your our symbols that we use for writing and so on, which again are used for some forms of maths, such as, you know, if you're adding two multi-digit numbers together, you might kind of write them down, or write them down kind of in your head, visualize, you know, how the two numbers are added together, that you can use these all together. So the idea is that the ones in purple are kind of your pretty much innate number system, and that what's here in the orange and the green are kind of what you learn, what you go to school to do a little bit, or the kind of procedures that you would do on those, so calculus and so on, which is using very much these symbols. And in fact, when you add x plus y, it's not clear that you're really using these magnitude systems, because x and y have no true numerical meaning, okay? It's almost as if you're relying solely on other kinds of systems when you're doing that kind of computation. Although we can debate that, it's not. And also incidental features of these might kind of help you. So, so Chinese children learn to count faster than English-speaking children. One of the reasons is that the number naming system is more transparent. So 12 in Chinese is 10 plus 2, okay? Whereas here it's 12, it's like, what is that, okay? Or similarly, 80 would be 8 tens, for instance. So you once you've learnt up to count up to 10, you can kind of count on, whereas our children, you know, what is 11? If you call it 10 and 1, it's very clear what it is, okay? If you call it 11, you have to learn something new about it. And you find that this very arbitrary system kind of helps children in China, and that's nothing to do with their parietal lobes, that's something to do with their culture that is kind of just happens to support things better. So we're somewhere between the Chinese and the Mandaroku in terms of the efficiency of our system. And also the other thing that the verbal system can do, as well as kind of counting and so on, is the idea that we don't always use our core number system for dealing with numbers. So multiplication would be a good example of that. So when you do 5 times 6, you may not be computing 30 as kind of a number. It's almost as if you're retrieving it from memory in the same way as retrieving capital cities and so on. It's almost as if it's a verbal fact. And what you find is that patients with dyscalculia can often recite their times table despite not being able to do calculations. And obviously when they get beyond their, what they could recite beyond 12 times 12, then of course it breaks down, whereas other people can use you know, their number system and so on with this. And patients with aphasia, so those who lose their ability, their language and so on, including patients with semantic dementia, often they can't do multiplication in the same way, because they've lost their kind of system of words, but they can still add together written digits or do these kind of set size comparisons, okay, that don't depend on language. So things like multiplication is seen as perhaps not necessarily involved in the core system, it's involved in simply verbal facts themselves. Whereas addition and subtraction kind of don't really, you tend not to kind of store addition and subtraction facts in the same way as you store your multiplication tables. So the idea is that those, so when you do addition and subtraction, the idea is that you use this system, and when you do multiplication, you use that system for things that you've learned. Okay. Okay, yeah, this is a nice kind of study that kind of looks at that comparison. So this is not dyscalculics, these are just kind of you and me who are taught new number multiplication facts. So what we're taught would be, say, our 13 or 14 times table, kind of like Carol Vorderman or whatever, you know, countdown. And so what you find here is that when you don't know the answer to a times table, you have to use your core number system, which is your kind of interparietal sulcus. So if you have to do 13 times 14, you kind of have to use your number meaning system. Whereas if you've been trained that 13 times 14 is whatever the answer is, then you use a different system, which is seen as being involved in kind of verbal fact retrieval. So here, these are the same multiplication things, but one is before training and one is after training. It's kind of as if you shift them from one system to another. Notice also that before training, you're kind of using both hemispheres, and that after training, you're using mainly your left hemisphere, your kind of more language dominant hemisphere when you do this. Kind of retrieve these facts. Okay, anything about numbers? I think it's one of the most kind of interesting areas actually, because it really does pull a lot together. You kind of know how things work right down at the level of single neurons, and then it affects school level things, culture, kind of brings a lot of things in.